Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to TAP India and to TAP Talks, as we call the conversations that we have on Thursdays once a month. As you know, 15 of us galleries have got together to form TAP India, which is a platform to share artworks, to educate people, to converse and to open up different ideas about art. And today we have a very interesting talk. The talk is based on photography. We have Sebastian Cortes, who's a very well-known photographer, talking to Rahaab Allana from the Alkazi Foundation, who is a curator and an educationist. So I'm going to give you a little introduction on Sebastian, who is a photographer who is based out of Italy. Sebastian was born in New York and he took up photography while in NYU in the film school, where he studied and collaborated with many of the best names in the industry, shooting several short films. In 1985, he moved to Milan in Italy and started shooting fashion, travel, and lifestyle photography assignments for a lot of very well-known magazines and commercial clients. He's also a published author. Rahaab will tell you about his first book, which led him to photography as a fine art form, where he started working with black and white photographs. And Sebastian now lectures and offers workshops and mentoring in photo biennales around the world. His images are exhibited widely and reviewed all over Europe and in India. Sebastian has done 2 fabulous collections on India, which you're going to see in this talk. Rahaab Allana is a curator, publisher of the Alkazi Foundation for the Arts in New Delhi. He is a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society in London. He has curated and co-curated and consulted on several exhibits, edited and contributed to national and international publications, working very closely with museums and galleries such as the Brunei Gallery, the Fok Wang Museum, the Rubin Museum, and many more. A graduate of art history and archaeology from SOAS in London, Rahaab is the author of Inherited Spaces, Inherited Places, a volume on photographs by Raghu Rai of World Heritage Sites. I think when you hear the 2 gentlemen talk, you'll understand how competent and fantastic they both are and how much they know about photography, because they're going to lead us into their world. And I'm going to give it over to Rahaab to start the conversation and take us into the world of photography as you both know it. Thank you. Thank you both for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
It's nice seeing you. I would like to thank TAP India, all the galleries and all the people behind it, and Sharon's wonderful team that has worked tirelessly to bring us together. Sebastian and I come together organically every now and then, every few years, to talk about his practice, and it's a real pleasure for me to do so. And I suppose one of the reasons why it becomes an important vector for me to think about Sebastian's work is because I work in an archive on one hand, but also think quite often about what it is that constitutes the very notion of heritage, heritage management, heritage construction, and the transference of that. I mean, as an anecdote, myself, the first time I was trying to work with the museum, the curator of that specific museum, and this is in India, pointed to an image behind him, which was a poster of an exhibition, and said, "Why should photographs be exhibited in museums? They are just photographs." And that sort of led me down a kind of trail, a kind of ambitious trail to look at the kind of institutional history of photography in India, something that I have written about, which is coming out in a forthcoming book from the 19th century almost till the present. And as I maneuver that field, I realize that there are different kinds of endorsements that exist. One kind of endorsement is about how images are viewed of India outside India. At least this was the case to a great extent with practitioners from here who got kind of endorsed outside India and then sort of came back. In the 90s, this was happening a lot of the time. And it made me think about the kind of cultural balance, the sort of migrations of images across various platforms and practices. Of course, in the era of social media, one doesn't have to spend too much time to think about how images travel or how quickly they go across cyber networks. But one does think about what they mean. And I think this is exactly where, at some point of time, I always enjoy looking at Sebastian's images because they bring together that very interesting, imbricated field of what we consider documentary practice to be more generally. And I hope, Sebastian, that you will talk to that a little bit later on. But coming to this whole question of photography, the books that you do, I was really kind of interested also to think about our placement today. I mean, your publication, if we take it as an example, the SIDHPUR one begins with a poem by T.S. Eliot. And I really sort of enjoyed looking at that publication that is prefaced by this poem, which is actually from a quartet. But I suppose he's talking about being rooted, after all, in the present. And when I sort of think about your publications that are now a few years old, but also your practices that might have transferred and translated into different kinds of media-related, let's say, nodes in the present. How does one, or how do you rather, look upon those projects? I mean, we're talking about them a few years hence now, so you're kind of retrospectively looking back. But I want you to think about that with respect to where photography is today. And of course, I'm not just referring to the turn of media. I'm not referring to the fact that we've gone from analog to digital. But I'm talking about your engagements more than as a pedagogue who has taught photography, and you referred to the Sakak School when we were talking earlier. Your role as a pedagogue, looking at practice today, looking back at your practice at this very moment. So how do you situate yourself at the given moment? Let's start there.
At the given moment, no, I can only reflect back because I have not done much work beyond the fact of those work that was done in India. But first of all, I'd like to also thank everybody, and especially Rahaab for, as always, taking up the possibility of this exchange, because with Rahaab, as he noted, comes in and out of my life, and we come in and out of each other's lives in particular moments, I think, where we can reflect on broader issues. The last time I think we sat down in a chair when there was no COVID, and that was at the Biennale in Chennai, where we had a wonderful impromptu afternoon. So there are moments. I think the photography in itself now is at a point where it has the unfortunate thing of having been involved in a telephone and at the same time having become a sociological temperature gauge of the crisis that I think we're in. How do we measure the temperature? I think the moment that photography like Burtansky's photography and Polidori's photography has entered officially into museums, where the issue is the decay, the issue is putting a frame around the rupturous rapport that the man has with his environment. I think we now begin to understand that photography is not only an aesthetic tool, but it is a call to political awareness, but in a different vest, in a different way than photojournalism used to do. Photojournalism used to take life as it is and give us an extra dose. Fine art photography tries to isolate it within a frame and pick a specific poetic issue, because life in its sense, even in its most tragic moment, is poetic. In the end, there's the tragic poetry and there's poetry of beauty. And I think these two things have come now together in a way. And the poetic is now exalted by the chromatic element, which has now become almost a vice. There are photographers that are making an enormous, how could I say, rough around the collar of being chromatically different. And the Germans began this, the German school started this aggressive type of altering reality to make reality more real. Now, it sounds incorrect, but it is correct, because what happens is that your observance of reality is awakened by the fact that you see a dissonance. If you see a dissonance, then you begin to put yourself in awareness. And essentially, photography is that, is to raise awareness, to bring you to stop. And that's the photographer's wonderful tool. He forces you to stop. And that is a contrary reality for today's world, which is always run, run, run. Now, the photography that I used to do before, which was fashion photography, which was photography that was for sale in the real sense of the word, in the sense that I was a slave to the market, that evolves in a different way. That is with speed, because a magazine cover, as long as it can last, is a month. A magazine insert that you may have done 8 pages of, which you took you 4 days to do, disappears. Now, when you get into books and you get into fine art, you begin to, and you make it your way into galleries and into the wonderful concerts halls of imagery, which is the museum, then you begin to halt the image. And in that sense, between politics of awareness of the tragedy of our current situation and photography, I think that's where we are. As a pedagogue, I always used to tell my students, I don't care how you click, I care how you tick. And so I want to know where politically you stand before you take the image. So I would have them read books, I would have them, and then they would have to, and this would sound very strange, but I would give them a list of photographers and they would have to review them and tell me, what is the photographer saying? And they would look, well, sir, they're not saying anything. They're just showing us an image. And I said, okay, you're not looking long enough. Keep looking. And then they began to understand. And so when they chose one or the other photographer, I said, well, now I want you, in a very Japanese way of learning, reproduce that image that you see. Find something that is contextualized within what you have seen. And from there, you begin to get something new. Rahab asked me about SIDHPUR. SIDHPUR is a wonderful institution. I think one of the warmest and most open of the photography schools, which is a hard word to use when associated to photography, because photography is basically an intuitive action, which really requires no school. All I can do is tell about my tears and about my difficulties and show them images of myself, that means done by myself, not of my ugly mug, but more than anything else, introduce them to the work of other photographers. And that they begin to understand that there is history in the making of images, that we are piling up images one after the other. And this is the respect that you have to have. And I think in that sense, which leads me to the question that Rahab raised also about where I think I am. At this point, I'm an archivist because I am reviewing my work and beginning to, how can I say, edit it in a different form, placing it in different contexts. I have a lot of work that I've never shown, and the 4 essential works that I've done in India, the books, Pondicherry, Symmetria, SIDHPUR, and one more that I'm not going to mention for now because it's completely brand new, are all fruit of completely holistic moments, which I can go into when we go into the specific projects, so I can explain how they develop, but they also develop from a fear. They develop from my fear, which I had spoken to Rahab before, of being in a continent, a part of a continent that had been so photographed that to be original was an enormous task. And anyway, the idea of originality has always been a bit vague with me. I don't consider that you have to be original. You have to contextualize yourself in a discourse and be part of a wave, but you have to choose your wave. And so my wave came after a long session of having just put the camera down. Then as we lead into the conversation, I will tell the first moment that I got a real inspiration, and also the individual photographer of Indian origin that spurred me to make a reflection in the direction that I did.
Well, thank you already for those sort of reflections and introspections regarding your work. And I like the fact that you use the word holistic. It always makes me think about from Sakak going on to Aurobindo Ashram. It is the Aurobindo school, and I know you have a close association there as well. One of the albums, of course, we were looking at many years ago was of Cartier-Bresson's, and as far as schools go, he set up one of the first ones, as you well know, in Pondicherry. And we do have a collection of that material in the archive, and we did a small exhibition of it several years ago, of course, in Pondicherry. But it makes me think about what the mother had said once to Bresson, and she had really talked about the idea of the image having a ghost-like quality, that somewhere the aura of the image had to sort of show itself to the viewer and shouldn't be captured too directly by Bresson. Of course, there were so many conversations between them, many sort of, I think, moments that they also disagreed with one another, but what they certainly agreed on was that something should be captured of the moment of their, of their interaction. And I found that that ghostly quality does somehow emerge in different bodies of work, because it can also be given as a synonym for an echo, given as a synonym for what lasts or outlives the time of its origin and its making. And that for me is key with photography as well, especially with respect to what you refer to as discourse. Because if you are then at this given moment thinking of yourself as an archivist, amassing your own archive, but also amassing various sort of, let's say, triggers that might come to you because of different archives, which eventually culminate into your work. I suppose my question to you then is a kind of theoretical or theorization around how does the archive become history? And I suppose the answer to that is via discourse and time. So that's sort of one transition, or let's say transformation, I wanted you to talk about, bearing this whole idea of a kind of Aurobindo school, which talks about resonance, which talks about transference, which talks about a certain kind of delivery and acceptance.
Well,
sorry, please, you could start with that and I can move from there.
Yeah, because you're putting a lot on the table, because that reminds me of a wonderful little incident. When you had put that book together, or before you were putting the book together of those famous photographs of Pondicherry, and then you had also mentioned of the famous photographs that Cartier-Bresson had taken. Now, there's a story behind that. There's an incident where Cartier-Bresson had contacted the mother, or vice versa. Nobody knows, because it's a bit of an ego trip which way it goes. But I think we can say that the two minds met in interspace somewhere, as great minds do. And they came together, and Mother had attempted at some point to start a museum on photography. She understood the strength of the image because she was a modern, a very contemporary person. You can see in the architecture that she supported and the people that she surrounded herself with. The only trouble was that she didn't understand the fact that a photojournalistic photographer like Cartier-Bresson was also a businessman. And so when he was told how to photograph, the first thing he writes in his diary, I have found diary notes where he's very upset by the fact that he's given very little access. He has to stay far. He's treated pretty much as a, how can I say, an accessory, where he's used to being sort of a bit more key in the moment. So what happens to him? He gets so nervous that his photographs, quite a few of them are out of focus, which is rather funny because, and he couldn't understand why. And at that moment, he thought that, and that is the aura, I think, the fact that he realized that maybe he was in the presence of certain greatness that he hadn't explored yet. That was that ethereal property that some human beings have, very few, that bring you a bit to have shaky knees. And he, having been a man who never had shaky knees because he was always spot on his, and he knew how to use, that introduced him to a different dimension. And I think this is the reverence that comes when there are moments like that. And I very much believe when I came to Pondicherry the first time, and began to think about doing a project, these stories were swirling in my mind, and also the fact of having this sleepy reality of a ex-colonial reality that had sort of slipped into the forgotten aspect of history, which is really what is not written anymore, but what is lived in the atmosphere of the past. That is what I go looking for, that layer of the past that houses the new, that leaves a legacy, and that creates a language of union between the present and the past. And that ties also into the language of T.S. Eliot, who I think loved to think of us as a trajectory moving this way, but at the same time moving this way. Because as we progress in this, we age, and the two things together, time present, time past, or end up being in time present because we are this alchemy of both. And physics sometimes tells us about these things. And I think Einstein even analyzed the concept of this speed that we are through and back. I mean, the physics, let's leave it out. But going back into photography, that is what I like to call heritage. Why do we want heritage? Why do we need it? This is a good question. And why does photography help or not help heritage? Photography fixes us to study and to concentrate on an image. Heritage requires that the remembrance be done. So the remembrance is useful because we need a foothold in the past. If you philosophically consider the past as a useful thing. Now, I don't think that philosophically you could be a nihilist completely and say, no, I don't need it. You need it because you are the past in the sense that you are an extraction of your parents and all the rest. And so I expanded to the architecture because the architecture is what houses us and places us in contact with that reality that we need, which is the home. The home, and which leads me to the artist that really injected this into me when I first came to India and I met her, was Dayanita Singh. Dayanita Singh, with her most wonderful project, which was called Privacy, broke away from that aggressive interpretation of the exterior India and decided to go in. Decided to penetrate the private, decided to wade into families' homes, friends, neighbors, and bring out that which had been hidden to the larger world. And in fact, her book Privacy initiated a whole different process of looking at India. And when I saw that book and I saw the show in Calcutta at a very nice gallery, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, there was another action that Dayanita was performing. She was inviting the people back that she had photographed and giving them the prints. And I found that a wonderful circle between the capture, the thankfulness of that access, because access is what it's all about for me. I get access to that which others don't. So my going behind the scenes and being allowed into the privacy of other people's lives, as Dayanita Singh did, requires that you have a thankfulness, that you have to somehow give back. The way I have given back is by trying to exalt the beautiful. Now, using this word beauty, which is a word that has fallen out of grace in a way, because in the contemporary, more modern idea, beauty is a sloppy word. It is a little too sappy. It is, but for a long, long time in the history of art, beauty has been a very important concept and a driving concept. So when I say beauty, I mean to find the beauty in the domestic reality. That means in that usual atmosphere that houses us as human beings, and trying to find why an atmosphere, why a home, why a location has a special atmosphere. And that is what I hope that I transform from simply viewing it to framing it and then post-producing it and then offering it back. And I think that's what all my colleagues nowadays are trying to do, who do this kind of work. Polidori, we can think of many other, Candida Hofer and others that are tied into this logic. They are more monumental than I am, because I still think they are tied to the logic of art nowadays, which means everything big and you have to have the wow effect. That wow effect I admire, but I think there is the more subtle beauty effect. When I say that, I love when people come up to me, like with my Pondicherry work, with my SIDHPUR work, with most of the work that I do, and say, I'd never seen Pondicherry like that, and I'm from Pondicherry. Or I have never seen my house so beautiful, as an old lady from SIDHPUR said, I'm just angry that I didn't remove the dust. And I said, no, the dust is what I came for. I came for the dust. I came for that which lingers there. And she understood it. Before, it was an aesthetic no-no for her. Then she understood what I was looking for. And so there, again, these are the beautiful things that come together for heritage. This is what heritage is. Heritage is those moments, those structures, those elements that anchor us in a past of which we are secretly grateful for, but in our contemporary life where everything has to go forward, they become a hindrance. And this leads me into the political aspect of my work. Why do I sometimes, or I always tie into the heritage groups that are in there? When I did Pondicherry, I work with INTAC. When I did SIDHPUR, I work, Simetria, sorry, I work with UNESCO. And these are elements of people and foundations and organizations that are politically motivated to doing the same thing I am. But I, as an artist, am doing it through that sleight of hand, which is photography, whereas they are doing it through organization, money, and political clout.
All right. There's a lot to unpack from that. I mean, one of the things that, of course, strikes me is your mention of beauty, which is also almost always associated with the sublime. Reminds me of Edmund Burke's sort of writing on the beautiful as the sublime. And I think it has real potency here. The porosity of what heritage is, according to this moment in time, really needs to be considered and then reconsidered, because it is not only in situ anymore. There are intangible and tangible ways in which we've already discovered these, whether they're in brick and mortar, or whether they're spoken about as oral histories, or now whether they are lived, which virtually on the brink of a certain kind of survival. And and I bring this up right now because so many, let's say, populations in Europe, even in this part of the world, are in this sort of transitory space, in this kind of space between what is home and what is going to be, a place of their arrival. And not knowing either is such a difficult moment for them. It's a difficult moment internationally and politically as well. And so many of the young practitioners and, of course, photojournalists today are focusing their attention on documenting this mode of exile making and exile construction and exile deliverance and intensification, which is deeply political and disturbing. But at the same time, as you mentioned, your sense of what home was, that frontier which became the home, which was already in place, which needs to live on into the present in a sense, because it carries with it, let us say, the weight of those transitions, transmigrations that took place maybe in the past, need to be remembered at this moment. They need to be recalled as maybe instances that can give us a guide as to how communities develop when they transfer from one location to another, and how they are helped as communities in order to live on. Something that, I think, and again, has resonance today and needs to be remembered. For me, this is, a sort of central facet to your work, because as one goes through it, and I think maybe gradually we should start looking at the work of Pondicherry, if you don't mind.
Sure, let's call up some images from Pondicherry if possible. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can have a look at those. When I was looking at this publication, yet again, I also realized that it's a space that you've spent a great deal of time in. There is this, for me, what you called a kind of nearness as well as distance, being an outsider looking in, but also being, as far as I'm concerned with this book, an insider trying to step away, but at the same time step into. These are sort of, I imagine, identities that have to constantly be maneuvered or be negotiated within your practice as you go along, taking images of this particular kind. And of course, they remind me, I wouldn't say of a certain kind of nostalgia of the still transience of 19th century photographs, but they make me really wonder about where exactly the place of photography is, today. How exactly do we look at images that you have created of a certain kind of tradition and a certain kind of history, and sort of create resonance for them at a time that is deeply volatile, that is deeply out of sync with the kind of syncretism maybe that you were trying to bring about while being an outsider/insider, while being a stranger, while being a voyeur, while being maybe an interloper, but also very much ingrained in that process. And it makes me come to this question of identity construction, because isn't identity then something that makes us commit to our work and not about necessarily where we are from? Isn't it about how we look at certain objects and decide to inhabit them, or they inhabit us, rather than understanding, where they came from necessarily and where they've arrived at alone? But their moment and their presentness is about how they associate with us. And so this whole question of identity and its construction comes to mind, because what also struck me while looking at the three publications we're about to gradually go through is that, and I might be wrong in this, and you can definitely highlight transitions between the three, certainly from Pondicherry looking into SIDHPUR, is that there is a certain language that you're comfortable with. There is a certain givenness of the moment that you're intuitively trying to associate with when you come to those exteriors. And then, of course, as you mentioned earlier, knocking on the doors, walking into the interior. But what happens when you cross that threshold is what I was interested in. What happens when you leave the outside and enter the inner sanctum, as it were? What is that experience about? And do you think that experience has changed for you, given the breadth of time that you have given these projects? And now, of course, looking back.
Well, thank you for that question. If we can go back to the cover of the book, if it's not too difficult to get there, I think I can use that to illustrate the logic of that one, this image. Thank you. No, back the image, this one. What do we have here? We have the layering of existence of a place. On the top, we have the people that were most influential politically over basically a century and a half. So we have a photograph staring into a photograph. And this is the eye of authority, and this was the eye that was setting the direction both politically and socially at the time. Then we have this empty room, which in its geography explains a lot of things. We have these old colonial chairs that have now been plasticized. We have the plastic, which is used instead of the old rattan because of economics, because of expediency, then we have the plastic chairs, which have become an absolute environmental catastrophe all through most of the subcontinent as a presence, but they have replaced that kind of consideration in any public place. That you begin to understand how, and this is why I used it for the cover, this is the kind of layering that I look for. I look for where the domesticity looks simple, but it's telling me something, and I hope that when it's put up on the wall that it's telling somebody else, both politically, socially, and anthropologically, an explanation of place. And let's not talk about the table covering, because that is a whole sort of lingering. It could be from a European extract, but it isn't. It is used, and everything blends. And that's what I like about interiors, is that the blending is what we are about. We are about blending. And also in Pondicherry, it was my wanting to diffuse the logic of what colonialism in this word, or Orientalism in the vastness of this word, could mean for an outsider like me looking in. And in fact, I chose 3 writers to participate in writing about the place, because it's not only about my photographs. It's very important, the writers that I chose. And if we can go back to the cover, please, so I can show the names of the writers. One is Amin Jaffer, who in the world of art nowadays is probably one of the most noted art specialists. And he started his career in Pondicherry. He began his career by doing an analysis of Indo-French furniture. He wrote a thesis on Indo-French furniture. So when and the funny thing is, I met him in Venice about 23 years ago, and very holistically, again, this is how my work develops. I talked to him about my project, and he fell in love with the idea, and I sent him the pictures, and he did his text. Same with Akash Kapoor, who has now become, and who was for a long time, the eye in the New York Times on South India. He wrote columns and columns on, then he wrote several books that have been very, very useful in interpreting the Indian dream, or the lack of the evolution of the Indian dream in South India. And he is from Pondicherry. He is a Pondicherrian, born and bred, even though he went off to school in other places. But so there I give the individual who comes from the place. Amin is the local who comes from outside and then goes and takes and goes out. And then I chose Pascal Bruckner, who is an arts supporter and non-aggressive, but certainly intellectually aggressive, explainer of the importance of heritage not being interpreted as an aggression. What does that mean? That colonialism was part of history, that it is what it was, a difficult moment, but it was a moment that we can excuse for it, even though now the apologetic approach for history has become horrible, I think, but that's a very touchy question. And he writes this wonderful expose where he explains how when he went to Pondicherry 33 years ago, he found it dead. He found it horrible. He found it a bit like Sri Aurobindo, even though we don't underscore this too much, but if you read his diaries, he says how he was bored in Pondicherry. I mean, it was a leftover from another era that had nothing to do with him, even though he was very westernized. And Pascal makes this balance, and he takes from the photographs the fact that he sees it as being reborn. And this rebirth is what photography can do. We have people, incredibly useful photographers like Robert Adams, who managed to reinterpret the decaying West of the United States in its most terrible moments and reinvent its poetic aspect of decay. So that is what photography can do for heritage in a way, to observe the poetic that is in what has been left behind or is in transformation because it is subject to the passage of time. And my attempt with photography is to, how can I say, intervene between the time, the place, and the logic of why it is important to observe. And if I manage to do that, I am successful. And the more successful I am is like within Pondicherry, I managed to save 3 houses that were headed for destruction because of the discussion that was headed up between INTAC and the relevant local government. And there was a bridge that was created between the family owning the house, INTAC, and the local government, so that they began to understand the importance of saving the location for posterity, for their children, and for history in general. So again, photography as an initiator, photography as a troublemaker, photography as a provocateur. When I presented Pondicherry, I did it in front of 3 architects, INTAC, and 2 social scientists, and that was the discussion. It was not my pictures, it was why my pictures could be relevant. And this is what I hope that I have achieved simply by going and looking for what I think is the hidden and the beautiful. If again, going to that sloppy word, but I do care to show what is beautiful in the domesticity. And I hope I achieve that.
Yeah, no, thank you for highlighting those particular aspects. And I think restitution, conservation, preservation, these resonate quite deeply with respect not only to to the idea of the archive, but also to the idea of what will actually cross the threshold of existence in terms of how long it will exist for and what that really means. I mean, will there be a moment at which we realize that for things to also elide and fade over time is an actual consequence of a certain evolutionary transition that takes place? So how much of history can we indeed carry with us? And I'm always interested to explore that as an idea with you, because so much of your work, for reasons that might be yours and which reasons which might also be other, have something to do with the pre-colonial, as you mentioned, coming into the modern, let's just say that, or rather the colonial moment that is at the cusp of a certain modernity, and therefore transitioning into what happens in the post-colonial. There's a line of sight that can be drawn between, let's say, the 1920s, 30s, some of your other work focuses on this, and then, of course, where it is today. But as much as you talk of that, and that was also a moment of great media transition and the movement of what one would call, from the studio to the streets, in one sense. Chris Biddy has called it that. But on the other hand, it's also talking about how image making construction becomes more humanized to an extent. I mean, we only have to look at other large exhibitions that came to India, like the Family of Man in the post-independence period, 1950s, Bombay and other places that it traveled to, including Chennai, as a matter of fact, created this sort of awareness of the power of images that can resonate from different cultures across to other cultures. And I wonder now, thinking about photography at that point of time, how many images in the family of man actually had practitioners from India and residents, therefore, that needed to be made within. I mean, did it actually travel and grow as it moved? Or was it one kind of set exhibition? I think largely it was set, but there were images of Sunil Jana, I believe, that were inserted into it with the passage of time. Anyhow, that's subject for another discussion. But as we came upon this subject, and I think we should focus on it because it's a loaded one. As we go from, let's say, pre-independence, the colonial, to post-independence, and then, of course, the post-colonial, we have now arrived at the moment of the decolonial. How to decolonize, how to look at not only areas that are disciplinary, interdisciplinary, intermedia, and realize that there are maybe embedments within them. There are hidden forms of hierarchy that direct our gaze in a certain direction, that are actually very, very top-down without meaning to be top-down. So this comes to that wonderful moment that you talked about, those images that were shown to the people and were given to the people of whom they were. In producing a publication, and let's take on and tackle that commercial endeavor, right, of creating a publication that is an expensive publication and so on. How distant does it become eventually from the people and the places that need to have that, that need to see that whose lives they are talking about? And I'm sure there's a line of sight to this that you've already considered, and I'm sure there's a way in which you maneuvered that, but it'll be nice to know, because photo book making in the present is, as you know, I mean, it's transitioned from this kind of photo book making, which had a publisher. We've now gotten into the sphere of self-publishing, now gotten into the sphere where there's a great amount of intuity and creative, let's say, juxtaposition that is done based on the registers of memory, based on the registers of remembrance, of time, of marginality. How is this, you know, in this era of photo book making, which has changed so dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years, which is also the place when you produce these books, how do you place a publication like Pondicherry? Or let's come on to SIDHPUR.
Let's move on to SIDHPUR and look, and if we just get the picture of the cover up, we can begin also by examining the different object that was created there and how that is a totally different type of publication. Okay, if we can just stop on the cover. Okay, here we have a totally different approach to a subject that is different but similar, and obviously being done by me, the approach is similar. But this is a publication that comes out of a project, a personal project that was not necessarily intended to become a book. It was intended to become an exhibition for certain. It was intended as an important project, but it grew out of totally different concept. It grew out of a simple visit. I had been hired by a magazine to go shoot in SIDHPUR and began to understand that there was a deeper subject matter there, that there was something beyond what I could do in a week. So, which leads me to the interaction with the locals. What happens when I approach a subject, I begin by looking at it on the surface, obviously, because that is what it interests me. But then I begin to analyze and smell the social reality that lingers in the place. So here in SIDHPUR, I understood that there was an incredible dichotomy between what I was visiting, what I was seeing, and the reality of the place that it had become. What attracted me to it, and what attracts me to places always, is places where history has sort of taken a right-hand turn and left this place behind. This place is frozen in a moment and is an explanation in its plastic quality of a certain moment. And again, that leads into the idea, the cultural idea of layering of different influences, whether they be from foreign countries or not, the layering of architecture, the layering of lifestyles. And here we have a very interesting situation because it is a Muslim community. We begin by a very strong element, a religious element, which forces a reflection of a certain type. And then we begin from a total appreciation of the world, the European world, done by very rich Bora merchants. They traveled, they saw, they bought books, and they brought back influences, which then brought them to initiate a rapport with their inside. Now, this picture, I think, explains it very well. We have this very strongly etched interior. We have the force of memory in the photographs. We have these false columns, which are elements that are taken from different cultural, you can find as far north as Sweden and maybe as far south as you can go. And then in the middle, there is tradition, absolute tradition, which is the woman who lives in the house now. Now, this house is almost 100, maybe 200 years old. And the fact that she let me in, which is an interesting story. She had heard about me as the Westerner who had come into town. And being that I had as a translator, a person that was well known in the community. Now, all of this social networking, let's call it that, is part of what I enjoy, because it leads me in, again, to the private sphere. And I had been sent there by an art director originally that I worked for the magazine, who was a Bori. And she had a series of family relations, and she also had a home there. So the home was offered to me, the relations were offered to me, and it was up to me. The challenge was to raise the awareness on something that both her and she for a long time, because she's a resident up there, and an immigrant resident because she lives in Bombay, and myself because I'm fascinated. And she called me up one day and said, Sebastian, I know you're going to love this place. So this way, holistically, these things are born. But there's only one moment when you really smell that there is something important going on. So this lady, who is a force in the community, when I came to the door, she was not dressed that way. She let me in and left me with the servant, who did not let me out of the room, kept an eye on me because I was afraid that I might steal things, and was very curious to know why the hell I was interested in photographing her house. But when she saw the way that I moved around the house, and through very brief communications of what I was trying to do, and when I showed her one of my books, she went upstairs and changed. She put on this outfit, which is a typical Bori outfit, and the colors and everything, and she stood exactly there. This photograph was made by her. This is the center of her house. This is where she saw herself as the grande dame of her house, where she thought that she understood exactly what I was doing. And these are these moments that carry on the interaction between myself, the locality, the place, and the force of photography, where if you become theatrical, as some people have the capacity to do, they interact, they become the element, and that brings the human element into it. I can do only with the architecture, but when the human element comes in and explains and gives more warmth to the image and gives more dimension, then the human element is brought in, and it initiates a whole series of other events. This woman ended up speaking to several other people, and I ended up being called into several other homes because of what I had done here. Now, that is the wonderful aspect of this process of research. And each one told about their family, each one told about the travels to North Africa, the business, the way the business went, the way the business didn't go, the difficulties. And that's why the poem by T.S. Eliot, Time Present, Time Past, is so important, because I'm in a time past, but I'm in a time present, in the moment that I am. Here is a room that has not been open for at least 10 years. It is dusted, but it is not open. And yet it tells a whole story. It lingers, and it's full of the way that they cover the past, they save it for a future. And what's the future? A wedding. Most of these homes are just kept like this for a wedding, for a moment of gathering. Otherwise, they're just monuments to past glories. This again is the architecture, which could be, this could be a house in Sweden, if you think about it, if you think about the colors, if you think about it. And so I tried to look for where the motif came from, to try to, and I wanted to interact with the owners, but the owners were somewhere in Bombay. I was left with this caretaker woman who I found fascinating, the color and the sweep of her dress, which was totally different from the traditional Bori dress, but she was the caretaker. She kept this house immaculately clean, maybe for years, in the total silence of non-existence, but as a preservation of past. So she was the gatekeeper, caretaker, and she was the one. And I decided to make her play a role because of the elegance of the sway that she had, and the fact that she was a counterpoint to the elegance, the typical Bori elegance, which was the other woman that we saw before. Here we have a very arrogant young child who had been running back and forth in the room as I was trying to photograph. And all of a sudden I told him, I want you to think of yourself as a future prince, which in the lineage that he has in his family, it could have happened. Mm-hmm. He could have become the merchant prince. Situation did not go that way, but he looked at his attitude, look at the sway that he has, look at the sureness in his gaze. And when he sat down, all done by himself, when he sat down like that, I said, okay, he has it in his blood. It's there. It's still lingering. He has this, and he went himself to get dressed up like this. So again, these are all small little elements that I pick up. Again, as a foreigner, I'm not judgmental on them. I'm just an observer. So I can't make all the cultural links. I'm just a fly on the wall that sets up the stage. And this is what I enjoyed, especially in this project. So many unforetold moments that just happened on their own, both in the discovery, the entry, and what unfolded in front of me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sebastian, for those detailed sort of descriptions regarding your work. I just want to point out that we're out of time. It's now time for some questions to come in, but as they perhaps start rolling in, one of the other provocations I remember this publication, and I think as one goes towards the end of the publication, if I'm not mistaken, there's an image of women, I think you've taken from behind, who are getting up from prayer.
I think we have it there. I think I sent it in, or we can look at it if you want.
I would like to look at, I'd just like you to reflect on that particular image because it struck me as something entirely different from the rest of the series. It struck me as a moment that you had captured. Your sort of photographer's eye transitions from this, these sort of moments that you have captured to something that is
there it is,
of being part of something that is more communal, something that is more community oriented. So when I see these photographs, one of the things I ask myself, or I ask of you, because you've often thought about photography or your photography as something that emanates from your engagement with anthropology, with observation and participant observation as a key sort of node, where you think you are perhaps a fly on the wall, but perhaps your presence is also there because you've made it into an oeuvre of a certain kind. You've made it into something that is also quite stylistic. Your photography can be told, in a way that it is yours.
Yeah.
And I found that this image suddenly changes a little bit of the dynamic in one sense. The one hand, you are not present in front of them, you are now suddenly behind them. And this is perhaps a moment of engagement that do I say veers towards a kind of more social engagement, not something in which there's a performing for the camera, not something that is where people, either you or your participants or your subjects, as it were, are being staged or staging themselves, but suddenly a moment of just pure engagement, where they are in the middle of a certain action, where you are present at that moment, that sanctified moment. And then, you capture something of life itself. And I say this because, as you keep pointing out, heritage, the dynamic of what is preserved needs to have life, needs to have a trace of that, needs to be ebbing and flowing with the pulse of that moment. And as much as I enjoy these, the photographs of the exteriors, the interiors, I'm also missing that somewhere. I'm asking the question as to where is the voice? I'm asking the question as to that participant who is part of your world. Are they speaking also to the viewer, that is us, the spectator? So the whole question of viewership, spectatorship, and I say this fully understanding that you have a particular engagement and style of engagement, and not every kind of photography can be like the other. But once again, coming to this notion of what can and should be preserved, those are the people and the communities you are preserving, maybe through their built heritage, but also it is their lives. And my understanding is their lives have gone through, in many respects, a wave that is up and down. The Richter scale is sometimes off, only because they have gone from being extremely, as it were, well-to-do, prosperous families, to now being at the cusp of a life where those buildings that they are within need to be preserved, because in a way the economic structures have changed, the social dynamics have changed, the religious sort of interminglings have changed. And so how do we hold on to this everlasting sense of heritage while everything around us right now is telling us that change, good or bad, is at your doorstep? So that story of the subliminal, once again, but also the very real, is something one of my last questions before we get into the audience questions.
I would answer. Sorry, I didn't mean to butt in, but I would answer the question over the leading in from that image that you mentioned, the religious moment, let's call it that, to maybe inserting some of symmetria, so that I can talk to that fact of the fall from grace, because it's a very important element that you're talking about. So I'll start by, if you had finished with your question, is that yeah, okay. My reason for photographing and including that in the book is that I was feeling that I was allowed to come and join in a very private moment. And the women that had let me into their homes, because they were mostly women who were tending the house, essentially wished me very forcefully to be there. And they had on various occasions told me about this gathering where they would go to prayer. And then now, normally they are, as you see in our photograph, you could see that there is obviously the men are on one side and the women are looking towards them. And what I felt in looking at this image, besides the chromatic element which engaged me, and it's slightly photojournalistic, you're right, it's a little bit out of my normal context, but it gave me this wonderful feeling of hope. They are projected towards a sense of the divine, and their reason for continuing everything that they're doing is encapsulated in this spiritual moment. Essentially, in that community, the faith has become much stronger than the rocks that surround them. The rocks and the buildings are just an element of the past which they're keeping because they have to, but they really don't know what to do with them. And the interesting thing that came out of this is that there began a sense among the women, because I've kept in touch with them over time, over the last 4 or 5 years, they have gained a sense of relevance. the radiance of the photographs and my bringing to the attention through the use of photography their homes to themselves, which is quite amazing, has made them more aware of what they had and more proud to what they had. And now they are trying to conserve. They are no longer see it as a problem, but they see it as an asset. Now, remember, all of heritage is the attempt to take what is in existence that is old and make it useful for the contemporary. And so this wonderful element brought me to want to take that photograph, because I thought that that encapsulated that. Now, if we can lead in with Simetria, I can answer the next question talking about my most recent project, which is on Chettinad. I start by, if we can hold this image for a second, the title, Simetria, simply because of, I use this geometric photograph of two buildings built exactly the same side by side by two wealthy merchants, Chettiar merchants, two brothers, to dynamize the idea that essentially the Chettiars evolved their officialdom and quality as human beings in the interaction with the world that was around them in the latter part of the 1800s and the early part, the late part of the 1700s, the early part of the 1800s, in their symmetric quality to handle finance. They were finance geniuses. And this genuine quality of their genius goes back to the 1300s, but they were smaller merchants. And what happens is that the English come, as we know, and settle in, and they become their bankers. Essentially, the Bank of England uses the Chettiars as a form of an arm into a financial presence that they could not handle and they could not manage, because they did not speak the language, they did not understand the customs, and they, more than anything, they did not understand the necessity of having complete 100% trustful relationships between the area of the Bay of Bengal. The Bay of Bengal grows and migrates and develops and becomes the wealthy place that it becomes because of the Chettiars. And the Chettiars, my looking at their buildings is a testament to their grandeur, which leads me to answer another part of Rahab's question: what takes place? Well, essentially, in the latter part of the 1700s and the early part of the 1800s, the Chettiars grow immensely. They become financial kingpins to the extent where they have brought their wealth to such a height that they are importing automobiles from the West. Each of the larger houses has 12-car garage. The houses are palatial. They're huge. But notwithstanding the fact that they're huge, they are temples, essentially. They are temples to their wealth because they don't really live there that much, because they're always off on a mission, because the men would do 4 or 5 year stints. And I begin with this photograph because this is the inside of a temple. This temple geography, as I call it, photographic geography, is now, it becomes symbolized in all of the structures that then we will see in this brief example. So here again, past, present, and future, how the deep past becomes the present that I try to echo, and in the future, what will it be? That is the question of heritage. Again, the same thing happens here. The people become aware of what they have. If we can go on to the next picture, they become aware of what they have. They begin to, how can I say, be useful to themselves in trying to be modern in the container. How can the container become modern? That is the big question. Besides tourism, we have film sets, we have, next picture, please. Film sets, we have all sorts of possibilities, but essentially what's happening is this decay. We have these whales, these huge buildings that are falling apart. They're enormous, they're gigantic. Next picture. and they have an incredible elegance to them. They have a subtle elegance, but the marble on the left in the columns, the black columns, are marble from Carrara. Can you imagine what it must have been like to go and transport this magnificent column all the way from Italy? What did that mean? It meant an expression of wealth. It meant the reach that finance can give and the power it has. Now, it is only an unfortunate element that needs to be kept clean. It needs to be tendered. It needs, and here we see the entire wealth of the family, the legendary quality of the family is expressed in all these wonderful portraits. And it's always talking to the past. When you talk to the people that are in these homes, those that can still maintain them, they take you to these photographs and they only are looking back with nostalgic concern for the future. And I think this can be a metaphor for what is happening today to us in a way, in general. This gentleman here in his total elegance is completely and utterly in a situation of financial decay, but his elegance, his presence is so memorable of a period, and he is of that period, he is of that elegance, but his pocketbook is no longer of that period. So this dichotomy, this difficulty, this inner sanctum of a moment, a glorious moment that now is lived in a different way, are the things, and the most beautiful public organization of watering holes. These watering troughs are the most elegant thing I've ever seen. They're beautiful, they're balanced, they're sure, there are many others in India, but these are located, if you look at it from above, you can see a grid pattern that was built so that there was never any lack of water. And they're still kept very well, and the transparency and quality of the water is immaculate. So these elements of wealth and preservation, and these houses now, unfortunately, I mean, the one before, these two houses are boarded up, but the interior, they used to have the most beautiful Art Deco furniture. I saw some old photographs that I'd ever seen, and it had all been made, handmade in Paris, but they had to sell it off just to keep the building. These are the dichotomies which I try to bring to the surface. I try to make as an argument for discussion. Here we have the contemporary and modern use of a space that probably would have never been used this way now, because it is a multi-family gathering where each one essentially is living in a room. So the glory of the past, the needs of the present, and it becomes a colorful. Here we have this archaic and almost undecipherable type of architecture. Where does the inspiration come for all of this? And what does it mean? I look at it simply for the pageantry of what is in front of me. The meaning escapes me because I don't have the capacity to understand the language beyond a certain point. I'm not an architect. I'm not an anthropologist, but an anthropologist can use this to understand further. I don't know if we have any more images. Here we have a courtyard, such a massive courtyard that that was the area of the kitchen in a house that extends at least for another 6,000 or 7,000 meters forward. But these are the dimensions. We have 4 courtyards like this. But now it just lingers in its elegance of design, in its massive quality, and it is kept up with difficulty, but I think with an enormous amount of dignity. And that in the end is what heritage is also about, is showing the dignity of an epoch, the resilience of the people who can maybe hold on to it now. And if it is applied to becoming either a hotel or something else, let's hope it doesn't lose that integrity, but it does maybe give the family some sustenance. And in the end, the sustenance is what the economy is all about. And some of these places, in the end, I'm very happy if they find a new way without losing integrity. It's very difficult, but it is part of the work that I enjoy doing. And that's why I think photography is important for heritage in the end.
Thank you, Sebastian. In fact, now sort of thinking about this conversation, I think the anecdote and how you layer sort of images, of course, also in your mind, and how you tell stories about them is actually a very key part of how one should see these images, or at least understand, the incentives, the intentions, and the context of them. And I'm sure as this book is about to come out, those things will become part of how one reads them eventually once they're laid out. And I say this also because, as we well know, microhistories, personal histories, the refrain, the sort of need to sort of talk about them as socio-political vectors through which we can understand our present become more and more essential in this time. But anyway, that's all we have for this conversation. I'm going to sort of circle back to Sharon and see if there are questions coming in, or whether we can field just a few of them. But I want to thank you, Sebastian, for giving me the time to look at your images and reflect upon them once again. It's a real pleasure, and I hope we can do this again and again. But for now, over to you, Sharon.
Thank you both. Thank you both for this absolutely wonderful conversation and for letting us into your private world. We were the voyeurs here, watching and listening to this beautiful exchange between both of you, and the way you unfolded these different worlds to us. The idea of the voyeur became more evident as the conversation went on, and we kept looking at these images. And what came back to me, this phrase of poetic decay of time. I mean, it's such a lovely phrase, and it really gives, it really encompasses everything that you showed us and that you talked about. So first of all, thank you, gentlemen, for your time and for allowing us this view of this fantastic mind and fantastic eye that both of you have, and in the way you see things, the way you capture things, and the way you encapsulate what you see, Rahaab. It was just lovely. And Sebastian, the photographs, I don't even want to, I don't have any words to describe them. I mean, SIDHPUR, as you know, I've been raving about it for a while now, and it's just something so magical, because we don't see these time warps so easily. You see them always, colored with something else, but this is really what you call a teardrop in time, right? And so my first question, I don't think we have time for very many questions because we're way, way over our time. So I'm going to ask you just one question. This is, where do you draw this line between photojournalism and fine art photography? How does that fine line appear?
It's a difficult question. I think I can talk about a little anecdote. When I was first starting to find people to write for my book on Pondicherry, introduction, and I went to visit several photographers, among them the master, who I consider absolutely the #1 photographer, which I will allow Sharon to announce. Who is he?
Raghu Rai, of course.
Raghu Rai, of course. And I was in awe of, obviously, of his presence and of his height, both physical and of stature. And he very quietly looked through my book and said, well, your photographs are very quiet. And I looked at him and I said, Raghu, your photographs are very noisy. And then he didn't know whether to take it as an observation, a critical observation, and he then understood, because he's such an intelligent man, that yes, because he's a photojournalist. As a photojournalist, he is capturing the outside world. He will not maybe accept this definition, but his entire world tied to his collaboration with the various agencies and everything initially was photojournalistic. Then if that image ends up on a museum wall, fine, we can begin to call it fine art. But I think that that is a photojournalistic adaptation of it. Whereas photographers that work, A, in large format, B, in a different, slower process, I think begin with a concept. And I'm not saying that they are fine art, but they begin with a different approach. One thing is capturing life as it is, which is to journalize life. And another thing is capturing that element of life that you want to transform into a document that stands with other documents. My images have to be seen in a collective. Sure, you can be enamored of one image or that, but as Rahab was saying, when you know the context of what I'm looking for, it is. Whereas a photojournalistic photograph has to essentially speak on its own. That one image speaks on its own, because that is a moment in history that has been taken. My way of dividing fine art and photojournalistic is one attempts to analyze the past, that which lingers. The photojournalistic is trying to tell you of what is happening in that exact moment and trying to give you a political analysis of that. And it is captured, it is not created. I don't know if Rahab agrees, but that is my, maybe weak, but my very personal interpretation.
That was beautiful. That's beautiful. So since we have to end this conversation, I have to say a big, huge thank you to you, Sebastian, and to Rahab. Rahab, I know what your day has been like with what you've told us. So thank you for being with us in spite of all the odds. And Sebastian, we are going to all meet again very soon. So thank you. And thank you all for listening in to us.
Rahab, thank you very much, Rahab. Take care and be well. But
see you all very soon, and we'll keep you updated on all our other programs. So stay in touch.
Get us together again.
Yes, for sure. For sure. 100%. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.